Been on James 1, 22 through 25, so we'll share that verse today. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. You know, anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and afterwards, looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they've heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. You know, the lesson to this verse is obedience to the word. It's obedience to the word. Knowledge is not the goal. It's not the goal. I hate to tell you, I study the word all the time, and I'm so grateful that God has been able to impress upon me what that means, you know, as I study. But that's not the goal. The goal is action. The goal is action. You know, we must receive the word as doers, not just hearers of the word. You know?
Well, this week I began early in men's Bible study on Tuesday and asking those questions, and some of us got going afterwards, but it was reflecting on the what ifs. You know, what if I hadn't done this 30 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago? What if, you know, and all those what ifs that we can spend a lot of time reflecting on. Some of that's positive, some of that you can turn to be positive, but there can be negative in it as well. But we get in these cycles of thinking many times, well, if I could only live over, you know, if I only could live again with the knowledge I have now, that I would change this or that, or, you know. Anybody not been there? What do you do when you think that you've blown it, you know, and you're not quite sure? You know, you may have to come. There's a point in life where you have to make a decision on a lot of things, and it's time to deal with it. And you pray and you seek for wisdom, and it's time to pull the trigger. And you go. And then you look back. Did I blow it? Was that not right? Was that not the right decision? I thought, I was pretty sure that's what God wanted me to do. But things, you know, the way they turn out in your life is not ideal. And so you think, oh, well, that's got to be a confirmation it was the wrong direction. And it's like, no, life's not that way, is it? But, you know, you think, maybe I shouldn't have changed jobs. Maybe I shouldn't have bought that new house. Maybe I shouldn't have moved to a different city. Maybe that big promotion was not the right decision. What do you do? That's where I was at, and that's what I was thinking, and that's where my head was when I began reading in Hebrews. And I, you know, read quite a ways, and I got into chapter 11, and verse 8 came up, and it just spoke to me, and that's where we're heading today. Amen. Verse 8, it says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. That's what gets us into this second guessing. Because we don't really know. But it's normal, it's natural to a certain extent, and I think useful in a lot of ways to reflect on the past. So, you know, we don't want to make the same mistakes twice, blah, 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 there's all that. But on some, and a lot of those things, it's not a matter of right and wrong. You know, do this or don't do that. You know, we're just trying to do God's will. We look for that, we pursue it, and then we launch off on it. And sometimes we just got to move on. I read the story of a couple that was from Canada, and I could relate. It was curious, but they said, it went like this. They said, in the early 1980s, I left a very good paying job in Canada and moved to Spain because I thought the Lord was leading me in that direction, but it never really worked out the way I thought it would. Yeah. Along the way, I got cancer. I endured a long treatment program, and now I'm feeling much better, feeling fine. But I decided to move back to Canada, where I'm a lot older now than I was when I left, And I wonder often to myself, was I wrong to leave Canada in the first place? How can I trust God with my future if I secretly think my past decisions were wrong? That's the sense that got me in this whole thing. How can I trust God with my future if I secretly think that I've made a bunch of bad decisions in the past and I was praying for direction there? That's the deal. That's where I can relate. Pam and I often have conversations like that. You know, you're reflecting and you think, how would our lives be different today if? You know, and you know, you can get into a conversation and you can have fun time with it, but where does it go? Where does it lead? Helpful? We've all been there one time or another. Sometimes many times or another. Because there's a lot of decisions that you can look back on. But maybe you could relate to buying a house that you thought was perfect and then you get into it and find out the foundation's bad. And it's like, oh boy. Now the dream house becomes the nightmare. Maybe you took a new job because your old boss was a jerk. Only to find out your new boss is a whole nother level of that. Maybe you decided to find a new church because you didn't like the way a lot of people gossiped at your old one. You got a new church, you liked it, you settle in and you find out, wow, they're just the same here. Maybe you prayed about a new business for some time, and when the time seemed right, you jumped in, took a step of faith, and went out there after that, and 6 months later, you know, you're looking at foreclosure, you know, and it's like, it's a difficult time in this culture to start a new business. One key factor joins all those, if you can relate, and that is that you prayed about your decision before you made it. You prayed and asked God to guide you, to direct you, to give you a peace. But it didn't work out the way you thought it would. I can sure relate. What can be worse than just reflecting on things not working out the way you thought is on bad days when deep down in your heart you're asking God those same questions. How can I trust you, God, with my future when I secretly think I made bad decisions in the past? And I was asking you for help. So that's where we just have to be honest in this process. These examples are all common to us, and we all have our stories. Things that, you know, it didn't work out the way we thought they would. So does that mean it's a failure, or does that mean it wasn't God's will? When you read the story of Abraham, who answered God's call, it puts it in perspective for us, and I think it's going to be a big help. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, it says, and that's like Iraq. He left a country where he was very wealthy, very successful, had a wealthy family. He was an old man, 75, when God spoke to him. He gave up his idol worship, which was, I wasn't talking to you specifically, which I know you're far younger than that. Months and months. Abraham gave up the only religion he'd ever known to respond to a voice he heard, God talking to him. And he set out to follow this voice, this God that he was just learning about. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. That verse illustrates to me the key truth about this life of faith is you don't know the big picture before you go. You know, you hear the voice of God, however that plays out in your life. To him was an audible voice. Moses was a burning bush. We've all had a sense of God opening into us. That's how this adventure got started. Then you say yes to the direction you're asking for and you pursue it. But you don't get the big picture at the end. You know, you have big expectations. You have big hopes. You assume it's going to be this. But you don't know how things are going to end up in the end. And even when you think you see it, you don't. When God calls, he doesn't generally explain himself. He just gives you direction, and oftentimes will keep prompting you as you pursue that direction. And that's precisely the point that Abraham, where his great faith could be seen, because God called and he obeyed. He may have doubted. He probably did. You know, you see his actions as he's on this adventure and he's meeting new people. He's got a beautiful wife, even at 70 plus. And he's lying about it's his wife. Because he's afraid they'll kill him to take her. I mean, stuff happens. So he doubted, but he went. He argued, probably with God, but he went. He may have wondered what it was about, but he went. God called and he obeyed. And that's our proper response, you know, to obey and go. Without full knowledge, without full understanding. Remember that Greyhound commercial? Go Greyhound and leave the driving to us. Some of you are old now. It's not a bad description of the life of faith, right? You accept the call of God, you go with God, and then you let him do the driving. And that's hard, because we're used to driving. We're used to going where we want. And that's why we go on these adventures. But we take off on this adventure with God, and he's taken us to a place, oftentimes, that is not the decisions that we would have made. When you read about Abraham, you see God working him in many ways that I can relate to. In that when Abraham first arrived in the promised land, he immediately discovered that it really wasn't this land of milk and honey that he wrote about later for all of his descendants. Because, you know, he went all this way from a very developed, you know, society in Ur, and ended up out in the wilderness and up and eventually down into this promised land that was full of Canaanites, and they didn't really like him. And they were going to be long-term enemies. That reminds me to turn my phone on. Glad it wasn't mine. In Genesis 12, verse 6, it says, Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh of Shechem. And at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And from there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abraham set out and continued toward Negev. I mean, sounds normal, sounds right? He went to the land that his ancestors were going to inherit. Now, that doesn't exactly sound like what the first line was when I was leaving Ur, right? I mean, I look at that right off the bat, I'm going, whoa, you mean this is the land that somebody else is going to inherit that I have offspring? You remember, God, I got this, barren wife, more than 70 now. We left Bethel on the west and artificial intelligence on the east. I had to look that one up. I couldn't figure that one out. AI, yeah. Found out that, he gets to this promised land. It's full of people who don't like him, who are distrustful of him. This land known as Canaan, which today is like Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, southern portions of Syria and Lebanon. Much larger area than what, the Israelis were given after World War II. But it's, it was that area full of pagan idol worshippers that, it was different than the worship that he did in Ur, but it was not this God, this voice that he's heard that he's trying to follow. Not only does Abraham leave that area now, but he goes south. Now, I was recently, last February, was privileged to be in Israel. And when you go south of that area, down there by the Dead Sea, first town you get to is Jericho up above the Dead Sea up there. I mean, that's desolate land. It's one of the oldest cities on the planet. They have documents of people living there more than 7,000 years. And you think, why the heck would they? I mean, it looks like Death Valley. Literally. And it's lower. By the time it's the lowest place on earth. And you go down there by the Dead Sea and it's like, it's worse than Death Valley. And they went there to get away from the drought. It's like, wow, this is not it. They were living in tents. He follows this voice of God and he gets there and then it gets tough. I mean, that's what I see. He gets to the promised land and then it gets tough. After Abraham's great step of faith, you'd think that God would have given him a period of grace, period of peace and quiet and prosperity. Because that's what he had when God called him. But no, now he's living out in the desert in a tent in Death Valley with a promise that he's going to have all this land for his ancestors. Bottom line is God often sends trouble following a period of prosperity, and you see it oftentimes in the Bible. And there's a purpose. It's to test our motives. Are we serving him just because things are going well? What if we lose our jobs? Are you still going to call out to God, call him your Lord and your Savior? What if we lose our friends, our reputation, our business, our wealth, our home? Is Jesus still your Lord? Or was it dependent on these goals, these plans that you had, that you expected you got from God because your heart, your desire was there, you pursued that, and that's the larger point. It's crucial to see that if you look in the Bible, you see these type of stories again and again. The God who called Abraham is the same God who caused the famine in the promised land that sent Abraham south into this burnt up land, closer to Egypt, where he probably was getting his supplies from to survive. But it's wow. It's just not the way you pictured it. Not the way I would. And it's that way with our lives so much. Go back to the man from Canada, and it's like, well, looking at, with hindsight, he can't use the scriptures to try to guide him on that. you can read through the whole thing. You're not going to find anywhere in there that I found, move to Spain. Oh, okay, now move back to Canada. Oh, now, you know, the Scripture guides and directs us, but not like that. What you do see in Scripture is that God often sends troubled people's ways following their time of prosperity in order to test their motives. But the reality is life is short for all of us. And if any of us had a chance to do it all over again, there's a lot of things we would do differently because you learn in the process of life. But the reality is we don't get to do any of that over again. But that choice is not given to us. I mean, too much introspection about the past makes us tentative about the future. But the reality is it doesn't matter the decision you've made, where you've gone. It really doesn't. You know, God gives us direction. He does. He guides us. But it's not for our purposes. It's for His. And He'll use us in Canada, in Spain, back in Canada as old man. The point is not about, you know, the decisions you made yesterday. The thing that matters is that what you're doing today. Where is God is using you today in that plan and that purpose today? If we don't believe in God that He's sovereign, then we're doomed to a frustration because we'll replay what we look at as those bad decisions of the past over and over, and we'll get stuck in replay mode. If I just hadn't done this, then life would be better. The truth is, not necessarily. What we got to do is just move on. Focus on God and move on. Focus on His greatness, His goodness, and move on. Romans 8:28 has to come into play. We have to trust in it. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purposes. Abraham left wealth and prosperity and went into living in tents, eventually in the Death Valley. But God was faithful to all of His promises, right? Every one. All things. It wasn't as Abraham expected it, I'm sure. Because you can't make that stuff up. You know, have one son. And he's going to have, descendants like the grains of sand. He says, like the stars, and you will inherit this land. It all happened. But who's going to think that? All things. We got to watch out too much introspecting about the past. We get hung up. We'll get stalled. We'll get tentative. We don't want to blow it again. So if we just focus on God and focus on, in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. All things includes those things that we feel God's leading us into, and it works out great, and it's wonderful. Right? We never have a problem with those things. It's like, yeah, that's a God thing. But all things includes those decisions that we take off and do it, and they fail. And they don't go the way we expected them to be. We buy the house and it had all kinds of hidden problems. It was a nightmare. All things. It's either all things or it's none things, right? Scripture says all things. At some point we need to pray a prayer like, Lord, I believe you can use those things for my good and your glory. I believe. I believe it because your word says it, God. I also believe that I trust you and I am trying to accomplish your will in my life. God, help me when life doesn't turn out the way I thought it should be. And to trust you that all things are being brought about for your glory. The past is gone and you can't go back to it, so don't try. You can't live in yesterday. I don't know what wise man it was who said it, but he put it as the key to a better future is to stop trying to have a better past. Romans 8:28 must include those decisions that we make that we think are going to go different in what they do. Those decisions God uses for good, even though, if we had life to do over, we wouldn't do it that way again. But guess what? You don't get to do it all over again. It's just trusting God to use it for good. You can't go back. You can't stay here. Wherever here is for you now. So the point is, you got to go forward. Can't go back to the past. Not to relive the good times or to undo the mistakes that you've made. But you can't stay where you're at either. It's just time to move on. Trust in God. Life's like a river that flows. It's ever moving, ever onward. And we talk like that a lot here as our journey with Christ is a journey. We enjoy these beautiful meadows he takes us through. And then we get that steep grade that's coming up and we just duck our head, plow down, and just keep going. Because we trust at the top there's going to be another gorgeous view, a big meadow, something. And that's life. We just continue on. Brad's adventure after retiring from the city of Porterville, just hiking through the mountains for a couple of months. You can't just stop. I mean, you stop many times and enjoy a beautiful spot. But it's time to move on, You're not going to get to the end staying in this one beautiful spot. Doesn't matter whether you're happy about your present situation or whether you're trying to seek deliverance from it. You can't stay there forever. It's just, you stay there for the night, for the week, whatever, you camp, then it's time to move on. When you're tempted to despair, remember, you can't go back. You can't stay where you are, but by God's grace, you can move forward, one step at a time.
It's all about God's amazing grace for today, right? It's not in the past, it's for today, and it is amazing. So let's stand and sing about that. Hopefully it'll go with you this week.